Today is Tuesday, August 11th, 2015. We are here in the Woodridge Public Library, and today we will be interviewing George Jennings, who is retired and has lived in Woodridge for 47 years.
George Jennings speaking, and it might be interesting to people on how I wound up settling most of my life in Woodridge. I grew up in Chicago and spent my early years working in Chicago after college, and when I got married I moved to California. I spent 10 years out in a little valley out of Carmel in the Monterey Peninsula. It's called Carmel Valley, and I was producing films for about 8 years, and I had a partner. We won a lot of awards. We made about a film a year. We made 12 films, and they were produced, directed, sold around the world, and even in different languages, including Afrikaans in South Africa. This was an exciting time of my life, but it came to a bitter end when a partner would not get out of his home for our office. He raised Doberman Pinschers and was more interested in raising them in obedience training. I had one benefit from there. I got to meet John and Jackie Kennedy at Pebble Beach in a dog show. That was at least one reward for living with dogs, trying to edit a film, and he had almost like a kennel in the house, and then it cost me any savings I had, which were little, to get a lawyer to try to get something out of a company. I spent a good 10 years of my life working on making these films. But anyway, I still love the man, and I probably would not have been capable of doing what we did if we weren't together. So I don't regret that. But the reason I moved is my wife and I went back to Muskegon, Michigan to see her family. She's Finnish and Swedish, and we were concerned with our kids growing up. We had 3 kids, and there we were many, many miles from any connection with the only family we had, because on my dad's side, first of all, I lost my mother when I was 8 years old. So my dad's family, I had nothing, because he was a runaway from Utah, from a Mormon family, and so I had no knowledgeable relatives on my father's side. So my wife's family was so important. And the trip to Muskegon was to see her brothers, her sister, and her mother. But on the way back, I stopped at the company I had worked for 2 years. It motivated me to start my own company because I loved educational films. And I went back to California, and they called me and they said, "We want you to come back here because we want you to be a producer in film strips." And I was surprised because I said, "You didn't offer me, I was just there." And they said, "Okay, come back." So when I got back, it was 1968, a Democratic convention. I was staying across from the office in a hotel, which was near Grant Park. I came down to go to supper because the next morning I was being interviewed for a job. I got grabbed by a cop and with a billy club. And he said, "Don't you know there's a curfew on?" I didn't know that. But anyway, there were riots in Grant Park because of the Democratic convention. So anyway, my wife was very nervous watching television, seeing what was going on. So I went up and I called her. I'm okay, I'm just staying in the hotel. The next morning I went up, was interviewed. I loved education so much, and I had been working for a newspaper for 2 years because I needed to try and get something out of the company I spent 10 years in. And I was originally working on newspapers in Chicago, the Herald American, the Hearst paper, and had a newspaper background. When I was in high school, I was editor of my high school newspaper. When I was at junior college, I was editor of my junior college paper. I was a sports editor. Only 2 years at Daily Line, I became the sports editor. I worked for the Champaign-Urbana Courier. I thought surely I would be a newspaper man, but I was fortunate that I got saved from Korea because I went to college. There was a deferment. You would not have to be drafted until the war, until you got out of college, then you would be drafted to Korea. The war ended July 27th, 1953. I got drafted December 15th, 1953. So therefore, that saved me from that. But anyway, when I was in the Valley, I joined the Lions Club. And the Lions Club, this was out on the newspaper, was the last 2 years. And it was a great organization because it was no restrictions. We could have anything from dentists to the guy that carried the garbage or whatever. But that friend of mine told me about his son in Lisle, Illinois, at Winston Hills. So I had forgotten about that when we came to Chicago, and I had to go to work. And so I stayed at the Oak Park Arms with the family, and easily commute to downtown where I was working. But on the weekends we would drive north, and I was a South Sider on the South Side. I was never comfortable north. So then this friend of ours that was driving us around was trying to take us to Lisle, and I was trying to find Winston Hills. And then it turned out that this man who told me about, because he got off the train in Lisle, he thought his son lived in Lisle. So then I discovered it was Woodridge. So anyway, we bought a home here in Woodridge, and the first neighbor didn't stay long, but the next neighbor came from Nairobi in Kenya, the president's father's home. And this was an Indian family, and a lot of Indians migrated, quite a few to Kenya, and there were lots even down in Mississippi in the United States. But we have many, many here, and they were such wonderful neighbors. We sponsored them for citizenship, introduced them to Thanksgiving, introduced them to Christmas. And the block was interesting because one of the most wonderful families on the block were Japanese. They lived down in the street, and they had the most beautiful gardens. And anybody in Woodridge, they won wars, and they're still there. They're wonderful people. They had koi fish in the basement. And I remember as a kid, the Balaban and Katz movie theaters in Chicago at 63rd and Halsted, it was a model, the lobby was modeled of the Alhambra and in Spain, which we had been to. And they had this pools up and down the lobby with koi fish in it. It was fascinating. So anyway, these neighbors are still our great friends. They moved to Tucson, but sponsoring them for citizenship was a great joy. And he was such a wonderful man and smart. He became a banker and a vice president of Northern Trust, and now we see them in Tucson. But anyway, that's how I got to Woodridge, and I'm sorry it took so long, but I think it was worth it.
So did you learn any sort of Japanese from those Japanese families? Did they teach you?
And we had a wonderful experience with the Japanese on the Monterey Peninsula. The Japanese enriched the area with the beauty, and that's what we love as his neighbor. And we used to go to Oban Festival. Are you Chinese or Japanese?
I'm neither.
You're what?
I'm neither.
Neither what?
I'm a Filipino.
What?
I'm Filipino.
Filipino. I was just talking to Philippines at Comcast.
Really? Yeah.
I was telling them about the Shed Aquarium has a whole model of the Philippine coast. Have you ever been to it?
No.
Oh, well, the Shed Aquarium represents your country. And I was worried about the typhoon in China, but they've had all kinds of problems with typhoons there. But the mailman is one. Anyway, that's another thing about Woodridge, the culture, that people that live in rural areas, they don't have that cultural background, so we appreciate where everybody come from. There must be 80 different languages in the schools just around this whole area because of all the ethnic, and that's what's great about Chicago. And by the way, we have the most culture with the museums that any city in the world, we stand up to them. We've lived in different areas. I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Wisconsin, I've lived in LA area, I've lived in Monterey Peninsula, San Francisco. And San Francisco, by the way, we've got a better Chinatown than they do. We've got a better Chinatown than New York. When our kids were growing up, they got to pick, where do you want to go on your birthday? They always picked the Art Institute. And we used to talk about libraries, we used to get paintings from, our library was so small, it was in a model home, the first library here on 75th Street. And that was great because we had been in a library in the back of a real estate office with a little library, and a librarian who was a volunteer. And she was so sweet. She always recommended this one book, and everybody would read it. We never told her that the last 6 pages of the book were missing, so we never knew the end. So we came to Woodridge, and we loved that library, and they had a room down there for an activity for chess players. So we had our own chess team. You know this story, because what we did is we went to LaGrange, Downers Grove, Romeoville, Fermi Lab, Argonne, playing chess. But we also played Joliet Prison. And we went to Joliet Prison on a match. And they had just beaten Fermi Lab and Argonne, and boy, they were full of ego. And we went in there, and they closed these big iron gates around us twice, and we're going back into this dungeon. And the guy that I'm playing, he played 7 hours a day. He was a much better player than I was. I was only like 5th man on my college team, and I didn't play that much. But I love the game. I actually learned it in Wisconsin by some little kids. They were 6th grade and 8th grade, and I was living with them when my dad was working 16 hours a day at the steel mills, and I got farmed out to Wisconsin because he couldn't take care of me, and we had been living with different families. And so I had a wonderful year going to a one-room schoolhouse with 22 kids. They had Encyclopedia Britannica in this farmhouse, this dormant. We had no heat but a wood stove and down feather beds for sleeping, but it was a great year. Anyway, the chess game in Joliet Prison, the guy was a better player, but I checkmated him when he made a bad move. So we won and got out of there. 2 weeks later, there was a big riot at Joliet Prison. No more chess at Joliet Prison. It's long gone now, but if you ever see the movie The Sting, some of it was filmed at Joliet Prison. Actually, it's not even in Joliet, it's in Crestview.
George, you've shared some stories about when you were younger. What about your parents? Were they born in this country as well?
My dad was born in Utah. That's why he's a runaway. I never
right.
even knew I had any relatives of his till I was 62, because he told me, being a runaway, he went down to New Orleans to try to catch a banana boat to South America. He wound up working, grinding coquina shells for the roads in New Orleans. Met 2 guys, and he rode the carnivals all through the South, and then he wound up in Indiana. And he took a job in Chester, Indiana, where they had 2 movie theaters as a projectionist. I'm trying to think of the movie that was all about a fire in a theater because of acetate. And he was, as a projectionist, was worried about fire. But anyway, he met my mother, who was from Gary, when he was in Indiana, and they got married at Crown Point, and she was Serbian, Greek Orthodox. My dad was pretty much agnostic because he had problems with Mormon in his particular family, but that's because he was the oldest and there was too much put on him. And his father was a kid beater. He was whipped a lot, so he ran away. But at 62, I found out he had 10 brothers and sisters. And half of them he didn't never know because they were born after he ran away at 16. But
did you get to know him?
Anyway, I grew up in Chicago on the south side, and I loved it. I was right near, if you've ever read Devil in the White City.
Sure.
All about that wonderful Jackson Park and Olmsted and White City. And I could take my bike over there. And by the way, we had Victory Gardens during the war. And we had one in Jackson Park, and I had another one in the vacant lots. We used to use them there. I used to play baseball at the ball field at 63rd, the Stony Island, and kids would ask me, "What the heck are you chewing?" That's because I raised kohlrabi. They didn't know what it was. It's like a little cabbage, you know, so I could just stick it in my pocket and chew it in the outfield. But after the Columbian Exposition, the Spanish that made replicas of Santa Maria de Nina and the Pinta, they left those wonderful ships in the lagoons. And we used to see them till they finally deteriorated. You know, because of 1492, Columbus lost his shoe. 200 years later, we had the Columbian Exposition. God, if you ever want to read a great book about the history of early Chicago and White City. By the way, we had an amusement park on the south side called White City. It was like a Riverview at one time. Riverview was a big amusement park, not like Six Flags in a lower dimension, but White City was already gone by the time I grew up, and they had wrestling matches and roller derbies there and so forth. But I didn't know it was White City named after what the Columbian Exposition was named after. But let's get back to Woodridge. This thing about the Lyle Library, did I mention, I don't think I did, that the kids, every month, our child could go to the attic of the Lyle Public Library and they could get a painting to take home, and we could hang it for a month. And then the next kid, well, they didn't have to wait for their birthday. Every month, with 3 kids, they would alternate. And we had these marvelous replicas of these paintings hanging in our home because that whole top room of the library, we had access to these paintings. I just finished a book called Empty Mansions. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's all about a W.A. Clark, where Clark County, Las Vegas, is named after this man. But he had a great collection of art, and it wound up in Corcoran Gallery in Washington, and that whole wing. He tried to give it to the Museum of Modern Art within his will, but they wouldn't take it because of all the restrictions he had. So the Corcoran took it. They were smart, and they said, but we have to have another several $1 million to build a building to put it in. By the way, when I sold films, the most of what I made, it was so exciting because I got to go to LA a lot. I met librarians all over the country. I remember I got in a bind in California when I was in this lawsuit, and I was making very little at the newspaper I worked for. So I sold Encyclopedia Britannica at night. And I was a great salesman in the sense that I wanted to set. They hauled me up to Britannica, to San Francisco, to talk to the salesman because I was the only one in the history of Northern California that ever took the set of Britannica instead of the money. I remember I was in, I got this lead from Carmel. We had to buy our leads. It was $7 to buy leads for good ones, and one of them was at the librarian in Carmel that had been retired from the Multnomah County Library in Portland, Oregon. So I went to the house and I said, well, there's no sense of me talking about Britannica, but when you're ready to buy, just call me. But I'd like to talk to you because I was so proud that your librarian, your audiovisual librarian, bought all our films that we had. And so we just talked library and things, and he said, come on to lunch with me and we'll buy the set. But anyway, since then, I've had my name embossed in gold on this set that's in my house. You go to a movie on history or something, and you come home and your intellectual curiosity. Now we got Wikipedia, because you can go to Wikipedia. But having that Britannica in the home is I'll tell you another quick story. We were in Finland, because we go to Finland and Sweden to see relatives on my wife's side. And I'm in the oldest women's college in Europe at Ivalaiska, Finland. And they have this marvelous thing for the people that are almost blind. I didn't see that anywhere else. And they had these beeps on the street so that the blind would know when the light changed. And there I'm looking on the shelves and I'm seeing all these wonderful books in English by Mark Twain, my favorite. I did a series on Mark Twain when I was producing at Cornet, because I also made 330 film strips. Anyway, at this library, I was so incensed when I came home and I checked the Woodridge Library, the Downers Grove Library. None of them had hardly any books on Mark Twain. Nothing to compare with Finland. So I chewed them out and I said, the other thing, what happened to the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature? And they said, well, microfiche and all this is space and all that problem, and it was gone. So I had my aches and pains with libraries. And I don't want to minimize the value of all libraries. Andrew Carnegie was one of the robber barons like, oh, but when you see his name at libraries, there would never be in a small town. You got to give credit to the man. I just, and we're enriched so much. We met Eleanor Roosevelt at the Carmel Library. I got to talk to her. I was at ALA, and I spent 20 minutes talking to Dee Brown. I have met so many wonderful people through libraries and my love of education and libraries. I had the greatest joy. I just finished David McCullough's book on the Wright brothers. Mm-hmm. We've been to Greenfield Village. Have you ever been there in Dearborn, Michigan?
Oh, no.
They have the original wind tunnel there. Mm-hmm. They have the bicycle shop moved from Dayton. You know, we talk about the Henry Ford Museum, all about the cars, but I'm not into cars. I'm into enrichment. And actually at Cornett, I had to make a film on inventions in America. We were in Canada. I did a whole series in film strips called Famous Indian Chiefs, and I wanted to go to a churchyard where Joseph Brant, the chief of the Mohawks, he died and was buried in his churchyard, but that church had stained glass windows of all the Algonquin tribes, and the Seneca, Mohican, and Mohawks, and so forth. Anyway, then I was leaving there, and I saw this sign, Home of Alexander Graham Bell. So we go there, that's where the first phone call was made in Brantford, Canada. We originally went to Stratford, because we had been to England, and we went to Stratford and Avon, and so we thought, what do you say of Shakespeare? And that was so wonderful going to England. But at Bell's home, where he made the first call, there was also scenes of him with Ford and some of the other major inventors of the time. And at Greenfield Village, by the way, there's a lot on Edison, and if you've ever been to Edison State down at Fort Myers and
Wonderful
the banyan
place.
trees.
Wonderful place.
By the way, we were just at the Arboretum. Let's get back to Woodridge. I'm just not even talking about Wood.
Well, actually, I have some questions about your films. So besides the technology,
Could you speak a little louder?
Yeah. So I have more questions about your film experience. So what were some other concepts that you included in your films? Like, what were the other films about?
My first film was called Iron Curtain Lance. I went to Orchestra Hall with my date, which became my wife. And this friend of mine, who I had given him contracts, he worked for CBS. There was an anchorman named Fahey Flynn, and he did a lot of the outside camera work for him. And there's a wonderful man, and he said, I'm going to Moscow, East Berlin, and Czechoslovakia. It was a Communist Youth Festival in Moscow. He came back to Orchestra Hall. He was showing the original film, and he was just narrating with no sound. You know, he just talked to it. And it was 9,000 feet of film that he had, and he just boiled some of it down to show at Orchestra Hall. When it ended, I went up to see him, and I said, where are you going next? He said, I'm going to Berkeley and then I'm going to Harvard. It's like 2 weeks spread between each. I said, are you showing the original? He said, yes. And I said, well, you won't have a film by the time you come back. You cannot use the original and get any copies from the film. You're going to ruin it. And I said, I know at Cornett when I worked there, they wouldn't do a film on, it was a McCarthy age. You don't know about McCarthy probably, but he was trying to call everybody a communist.
Right.
Well, you do. Well, anyway, it was a horrible, horrible time. We had the John Birch Society all over the country, and we're almost coming back to that with this conservatism idiocy. So anyway, I had to do something quick. I was working for a company called Cook Electric, and we were involved with a lot of government films. As a matter of fact, we were loading the parachutes for the Jupiter nose cone right in Morton Grove. I used to go to Oregon to film because we had projects to film there, and I had to be cleared for secret. It was a lot of government stuff. We did things for the Navy and Air Force and so forth, but we had a lot of film. We filmed at Eniwetok in the South Pacific with the atomic test, and they came back with film they didn't use. Thousands of footage that they were going to just dump. I got the idea. Deluxe Labs in Chicago, the son of Deluxe in Hollywood, opened a lab here. I called him and I said, I need 9,000 feet of film on, it's something I need work prints. I need 2 copies. One is so the work print to edit, and the other one is for him to take on his trips. And the next thing is I needed about 5,000 feet on a photographer that did the Anna Talk stuff. He went to Havana, and he couldn't even look at his own film. Anyway, I just opened up all the cans, and I traded black leader, because now it was all exposed. I got all that work print, 15,000 feet of work print, edge numbered, and the other one not edge numbered for the friends to see, for nothing. And that launched me. I started my own company, and I moved to California. But I had to have 2 other films, so I made a Christmas film. I went to Valparaiso every weekend with my wife in winter. I hired the best German photographer could be, rented all the equipment, and I made this wonderful film. It won the Chris Award of the Columbus Film. By the way, Iron Curtain Lands won all kinds of awards. The United States Air Force was my first customer, 27 copies of my film. And when I got to Guanare, the Army Language School bought it. And they had me transferred to different languages. And the Navy bought it, the Naval Postgraduate School. So that's enough on how I got started. But then I made all different kinds of films that I wanted. One on poetry for kids. I went to Dennis de Menace Park. I saw coots diving, and there was a poem on that. So I said, I'll make a film on poetry. I made 2 films in Wisconsin, at the Poignant, Wisconsin, that the state came from. Forest Babies and A Badger's Bad Day. Then I made a film on safety with animals. I filmed some of it right at Willowbrook. And Willowbrook is one of the, have you been to Willowbrook? It's right across from College Page. And it's so close to, and anyway, Horse Farm. I made Horse Farm. We filmed at Laguna Seca with a thoroughbred from Laguna Seca racetrack. Determined was the first California horse to win the Kentucky. But I needed Tennessee walkers. In our valley we had quarter horses up and down, but the most interesting was trying to get the work horses, because this was a story about the change in social studies on how originally horses were for work and now they're for recreation and riding and a whole different use of the horse. So where am I going to get horses? I don't want Clydesdale pulling beer wagons. If you go to get strawberries, they're coming from Watsonville, California. Between Watsonville, there's a town called Castroville. And Castroville, artichokes come from there. At Watsonville, I'm driving through and I see a guy plowing a field with a percheron. So I talk to him, stop, and he really doesn't want anything to do with me because I'm talking about film. And I kept on talking. I said, I need to find bays and Clydesdale. I didn't really want Clydesdale, but Belgians, different workhorses. And I'd like to film you plowing this field with the percheron. And I needed to, and I kept talking to him, and he said, well, you know, I'm upset because when they filmed East of Eden, they misused my horses. And I said, well, I'm just making some for educational films. And then he went to get a peg leg, which was a belt around here. He said, I got to milk my cows. And I said, where's your barn? He said, I don't have a barn. It hardly rains here all year long. I don't need a barn. So he started milking his cows, and I said, can you please help me? And he said, well, maybe when Marlon Brando and Carl Malden came around here to do One-Eyed Jacks, which was filmed on the Monterey Peninsula and its property, they know what to do with horses. They weren't in the film, but they used them to work. So I'll let you do it. So anyway, it was exciting to get that. But we had, the other story was in San Juan Bautista. We went there. That's where Hitchcock filmed Vertigo. And that mission there had a fire. So right away they're worried about with a camera. You know, they wanted to charge me so much a day and everything. And get a grip and get insurance and all that. I just threw my hands up. You know, this is for schools. Don't you understand? This is now a museum. This is something we're doing. But anyway, I got my way through that because, you know, I talk a lot. Anyway, when we filmed there, we went there because of the standard breds. That's the harness horses. They had a track there. In other words, we were trying to show the variety of breeds, and we had a consultant from state of California, a very wonderful expert on elementary education named Helen Heffernan, and she said in every unit in, say, between 3rd and 5th grade, they study the county, and horses are so important in this state. And that film went gangbusters all over the state. I had a map, and I would drive up and down California. My partner usually took the south down from San Diego and LA, but I took the rest of the state all the way up to Oregon. I had a map, and I filmed almost every county in that state with our films. We only made one film a year. And at Coronet, there were very few films they ever made that sold 500 copies. Most of my films sold through 500 copies. I only had one film to sell a year, you know. But I just touched the button. But my favorite of all was a film I did on literature, American short story. And that was inspired with Steinbeck. We were in Steinbeck country. We used a sequence from John Steinbeck's short story, The Flight. And anyway, that was shown as a short subject in the Steinbeck Theater, which is now the Monterey Bay Aquarium, on that same site where it was right in Cannes. We went there, they still had the boilers from the sardine factories. And they were only canning octopi. And Doc's shop there, where Steinbeck was a great friend of Doc, and Ken Rourke, if you ever read it, was still there. And they used to go down to La Jolla to collect octopi, and then they sold them to universities all over the country for dissection and other invertebrates. And there's a great video that I was involved with. A friend from Boulder, Colorado, went to Baja to see a Cortez. It's all based on the Longest Sea Cortez by Steinbeck on his trip with Doc into the Sea of Cortez, is that area between the mainland and Baja, mainland of Mexico, and viewing whales on the way and exploring invertebrates on the shores. I donated that library, and you threw all the damn good videos away, and I picked a lot of it home, but I've never seen that. I hope it didn't totally get trashed, because it's a great video.
Maybe it's out there someplace.
But,
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
About Woodridge? How old were you when you first moved here?
Well, I was I was born in 31, and I moved in 68, 37.
Okay.
So anyway, I had 3 kids, and a son and 2 daughters. And the kindergarten was in a Methodist school.
Oh.
There was no kindergarten at Woodridge. They built it afterwards. And as I told you, where the library was on 75th Street. And we had a garden. Well, I'll tell you something about 1976. In Woodridge, all the fire plugs were painted patriotically. Years ago, we had the cows downtown, then we had horses. We were in Toronto, and they had painted moose all over. We went to this Catholic cathedral, a beautiful cathedral. In front of it, they had a moose dressed as a padre, as we drove all the way around. I had a photographer friend in Toronto that took us around. That's a wonderful city with all different people, and they didn't have slums like the big cities like we have in the United States. But getting back to Woodridge, there was a sod farm where 7 Bridges is right now, and there was a huge flood, and the sod farm helped because it absorbed a lot of that. And then there were farmers markets right between Hobson Road, 63rd, and Maple Avenue. And every year we could get our corn. Now we go to the farm. If you get fresh corn that makes your mouth water, picked every morning, it comes from Yorkville. And it's just at 63rd and Cass. Have you ever been there?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And tomatoes and all that fresh stuff. But there was another just quick thing I'll mention. Those years my dad was working 16 hours a day in the steel mills during the war. He was a stationary engineer. He farmed me out after I came back for 8th grade in Chicago from Wisconsin. I stayed 1 year, and I graduated in 1945 from grade school. We went to Texas on a bus, a 12-hour bus trip to Terrell, Texas, out of Dallas. One of the 2 friends that he worked the carnivals with had an Angora rabbit ranch. And I went there to stay a week with my dad, and when my dad went home, his friend said, I could use some help on this rabbit ranch. Could George stay here and for the summer? Oh, I got excited. My dad said, yeah. So anyway, I stayed there and I took care of plucking and shearing Angora rabbits on weekends. We had a lot of these were called they were red meat rabbits. We butchered them out and sold them, and mostly the neighbors were mostly black, and they would come over and they would buy a fresh rabbit from us. And then what we didn't have, we'd sell to the local shop. But they were so wonderful. On Sundays, they had outdoor church right near us, and I could hear the gospel singing, and they were such wonderful people. And it made me mad because I found more discrimination on the south side of Chicago when the blacks started moving in. We had a mixed neighborhood. It was Chinese, Italian, and Jewish, and everything. And then there were 4-block increments where people started moving because they were worried about their property. And when we had 1 or 2 black neighborhoods, it was just no different than having Chinese, Japanese, everything. It was cosmopolitan. But then there was hate. They were worried about their property, and most of them were just living in apartment buildings. What are they talking about, you know? But, and I had seen riots in Gary when I go over to see my mother's folks, and torch parades. You know, we heard about Martin Luther King, but anyway, when I got down south, there was one incident. I got off the bus and I went to a drinking fountain, and it wasn't the blacks that held. I was drinking from a black drinking fountain, and the whites said, "Don't do that." They weren't bad. But I had wonderful, we even built homes. The father of the people I lived with was a carpenter. And so we built homes for $12,000. I was just a laborer for blacks. And they got loans. And anyway, I had a great experience in Texas, and the people were great. And I love taking care of them. As a matter of fact, I was the most outstanding student in vocational agriculture. A kid coming from Chicago, I knew every breed of chicken. I got raised barred Plymouth Rocks up in Wisconsin. I got them from Sears, raised them, sold them. I trapped muskrats and stuff like that. But anyway, I did a lot of things in the woods, and I fell in love with nature. But when I got to Texas, I raised everything from okra to cantaloupes and watermelons, and took care of the rabbits, knocked tarantulas off my thing when I cleaned the nest because I had to watch out for spiders, and took care of litters and so forth. And anyway, I bought a rabbit. I named him Utah Boy. I won the state contest in Fort Worth for rabbits. I got this wonderful certificate, but the most exciting thing is they gave me a Hershey bar. I hadn't seen a Hershey bar in 5 years. But speaking of history, are you in high school?
Yes.
Were you a participant in the history fair just recently? You didn't have history. Well, in the state, all over the state and the nation, starting last October, history teachers told their students to take a topic. And my granddaughter was she's a freshman at Evanston High School. She took the Eastland, and then she changed it to Jens Jensen. If you've never heard of him, he was a student of Olmsted, and he's the one that created the Griffith Conservatory where Chihuly had his exhibit. He did Humboldt Park, Washington Park, and of course Olmsted did Riverside, and Olmsted was instrumental in the landscaping for the whole Columbian Exposition, but he died before it ended. Anyway, the big thing is everything's about Central Park, but he was a big instrumental guy. Jens Jensen did all these wonderful things, and my granddaughter, I went to Chicago and grew up there. I didn't even ever hear of her. And she did this exhibit. She won in Evanston High School. She won in the northern suburbs. She won in all the Chicago area. And that exhibit was shown at the campus at Illinois downtown. Then she went to Chicago Historical Society. Loyola University gave her an award for the Urban History Award. They gave her a check for $150, a certificate. Then she got notified that she had to go to Springfield for the state. 2,200 entries were statewide in that history fair. Only 70 went downstate. and she won downstate. They sent her to College Park, Maryland, the University of Maryland dormitory, so that she could spend 4 days in Washington and in Maryland, Baltimore, to go to the Smithsonian to exhibit her exhibit on Jens Jensen. The National Park Service gave her the one award they give to a contestant, one per state. She won the award for the National Park Service with a big medal. And urban history, what we're trying to do right here, and I'm destroying, talking about everything else, is fascinating. When you think about Woodridge, we have some wonderful parks here, wonderful park. I like to play horseshoes over at Echo Park. They have like a big type of garage sale there. They have Castellato Park for the picnic every year at 4th of July for almost free beer and hot dogs. They do events here that are wonderful. And my wife belonged to a wonderful garden club. My wife is a weaver. Illinois Prairie Weavers met for years in the Downers Grove Public Library. By the way, the high school you went to, are you at North or South?
I go to Lamont High School, actually.
Oh, okay, well, anyway, we never had our own high school. That's why they go to Down. I had the youngest daughter went to South, but the two oldest kids went to North. But both of them only went 2 years at North. My oldest son, summer, he was very bright, and I sent him to enrichment science from summer school, and they kept sending notes that he asked too many questions. They said, for God's sake, that's why I sent him. So I got ticked off that he was so bored with high school. I went down to University of Chicago. Ever since Robert Maynard Hutchins, they were advanced in giving smart kids an opportunity to get out of high school and get some education. So I didn't like their attitude. Their counsel was terrible, and I felt this is not right for my kid. I think he'll be trapped. So I took him to the University of Illinois. I love the stacks there. I spent a lot of time at the library in the stacks. One of the best libraries in the world.
In Chicago? Or downstate?
Downstate. I just went to junior college first. Mm-hmm. It's now called Kennedy King, but it was the teachers were better there than they were at Illinois because they were dedicated to students. They're from marvelous teachers. And I highly recommend College DuPage. She's been on trips around the world through College of DuPage. Exciting. I love hearing about them. But anyway, when I went down there and I said, I'd like to take my son through the stacks. No undergraduate can go in the stacks. I said goodbye. I took him to North Central. At North Central, he just went there 1 year, and the philosophy teacher kept talking about Madison, University of Wisconsin, very progressive. So we transferred him up there. But a couple of years later, I got a call from a science teacher. He was doing a project for Naperville where they were trying to save a watershed, and there was a research paper Mike did as a freshman. He used that to get the legislature passed to save this area and a fen in part of Naperville. And that was based on my son's research. It was amazing. I remember I had this oldest daughter. She went to 2 years at North, and she got a scholarship at University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, in raku pottery. She was fantastic in art. So they had fired, because of cutbacks, the art teacher. They had put the basketball coach, who was so unqualified that I got mad. So I did some research. I had some friends in Michigan that sent their kid to Interlochen. But you had to go through some rigmarole, and she got accepted there. She went 2 years at Interlochen. Now it's known as a music school, but it was an art school. She learned a lot of things there. Roger Torrey Peterson, a great ornithologist, taught one of her classes. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's one of the great ornithologists in the world. And he has all these guidebooks. You'll see him at the Arboretum, not just on birds, but he's also, we bought his book on wildflowers. And she did weaving. I bought a 400 loom. My wife is a weaver today. We got this huge 400 loom. And she was a volunteer at the Growl Mill in Hinsdale. Have you ever been there? She did the spinning wheel. People from around the world go to Hinsdale to Growl Mill. And she would do other things, but we had great potlucks with these people who were volunteers there, and the mill is a great place to take visitors from the area. But that loom, I couldn't put it together, but my daughter from Interlochen, she put it together. Then she made this one humongous weaving, like this. It was 9 feet tall. We took it all the way down from Traverse City, which is right near Interlochen, and then it wound up. Wait, well, Dad, you have to take it back. I said, my God, we got to take it back. Yeah, it's got to be back on the exhibit. So anyway, the sound from the wind on that big, monstrous 9-foot weaving on the top of our station wagon. Anyway, we had some wonderful trips up there. And speaking of Interlochen, it reminds me of the wonderful shows we saw there. And, well, right near there, too, was Traverse City, Cherry County Playhouse. Mm-hmm. And our youngest daughter, she was into theater. And we got very active with the Village Theater in Glen Ellen. Have you ever been there? Mm-hmm. Well, if you go take Park, if you go Arboretum, instead of going to the Arboretum, you take that street Park down in the Arboretum, mm-hmm. and you go right past before that main intersection as you come up and you're going toward Glen Ellen downtown. There's a little theater to the left on the side, not too far from that high school. Anyway, marvelous people there, and they were auditioning for Man the Moon Marbles. It was a great play. And our youngest daughter had tried out for a play at South High School, and she didn't get the lead. She'd been in other plays, and she was mad. So I had taken her to Oak Park to audition for the Crucible. They had a great theater group. And most of those people were older, and there wasn't the right part for her age. But she found out about this audition, and she had a call back. We have a part for you, we'd like to take the part. She said, well, let me think about it. Okay. We were shocked. So after a day or two, they called back. She said, okay, I'll take it. The critic from the Tribune came out, and she got the highest accolades of anybody in this thing. She went on to theater. She went to Illinois State. She met her friend who was, she eventually married. They did plays all over Chicago, and most of them were original plays. And I helped pay the rent on some of these places. Mm. And they were so good, they said, we got this one play, we think we'll go to Edinburgh, Scotland. And for the Fringe Festival, one of the biggest theater festivals in all of Europe, they took the whole cast, they went there, I helped pay for it. And they stayed with families for room and board. Their airfare was paid and everything. And then they won first prize in Edinburgh, Scotland. Oh, nice. A producer from Brighton, England, saw the play. I am planning my summer stock for next year. I want that play in your cast to come. We'll pay for your airfare. You come to Brighton. It's just south of London. So at that point, there were a couple people from the cast that didn't work out, but mostly the whole cast went over there to Brighton, England, and they performed for 2 weeks in England. And then they continued to do plays back in Chicago, and then the real world hit. They had to get jobs. Mm-hmm. And my daughter, I got her a job in a film company, and as I was still working in films in Coronet producing. And so in essence, my son-in-law, he got a job with a computer company, Exodus, that went bust, and then he's been with Trader Joe's ever since. He's been what they call a captain, and he's now has a store in Evanston. But for 7 years they were in Missouri, and that was hard because we made 40 trips back and forth, 600-mile round trip to see our grandchildren in plays, because our granddaughter was in a lot of plays in Missouri. And now she's training for one, a Gauguin short story called The Outfitter. And that's going to be in Evanston at the theater there. She's been in a lot of plays. This is a paid one. She's also been in some commercials, and she's a member of SAG, and she's only a freshman.
Wow.
And then, by the way, my oldest daughter, she won the Scholastic Art Award in textiles and it was shown the United Nations building in New York. And we went to New York to see it hang in the United Nations, and then I took the girls to see Barnum and the Elephant Man in the theater. And in Barnum, that was Glenn Close's one of the first plays, and Jim Dale was in Barnum. It was so fantastic. It was a little theater, and the cast came up and they talked to our daughters who were both interested in theater. By the way, my wife was involved in props at Village Theater on some of the plays as a volunteer, and my oldest daughter, she did horse heads for Equus for Valparaiso University. By the way, the oldest daughter went to Cambridge a year in London, and on a scholarship, and she became a jewelry designer in Aurora at a jewelry place, and then she taught in L.A., taught art, because she majored in art, and she was a jewelry assistant in College DuPage for a while, one of her jobs. Anyway, I ramble on, but
This is a remarkable life. I think your stories are far more interesting than our script.
I'm sorry.
Don't be sorry. Thank you.
Can we actually go back to Woodridge?
I didn't even give you a chance to talk. I am
Okay,
such a rambler.
That's fine.
I had a column in high school called Ramblings, and I stuck to it.
So do you remember any sort of social movement or political movement in Woodridge specifically?
Well, you know, we had a mayor who had been chief of police. His name was Kagan, and my wife used to judge the elections. We were Democrats, but there weren't few in DuPage, you know, and that family. So, you know, we didn't talk politics. The judges were mostly Republicans, but they were all friends, and some were in the garden club with my wife. And we had such fun with our kids because, like, our son was in Boy Scouts, and I went on those trips, and even in winter, I couldn't believe that people would send their boys out in the woods in winter with no gloves, not proper clothes, and we had to see what's wrong with parents. Really ought to understand that their responsibility as the kids, they turn them over to us. But anyway, and our daughter was in Girl Scouts. By the way, we had a nice garden right near the Girl Scout in Costello Park along the riverbank there, and we used to have corn and raise pumpkins and stuff like that. But my son and I one time couldn't figure out why our pumpkin vines were being eaten, because they were raspy. You know, who would want to eat it? We scouted out one time and we found this huge woodchuck eating our pumpkin vines. But anyway, and I told you about the Victory Gardens in Chicago, but we had this wonderful garden, we thought, by the river, but the raccoons. And do you ever read Rabbit Hill or ever hear about this book? You know, it's all about, you know, the animals surviving among them. And that's how they survive. Raccoons eat the corn, and the other animals had the rest of our garden. So
You were asking about political movements?
Yes, and also social.
And social.
well, that's part of the things. People we met at the gardens. We met people this way. People walked their dogs around the neighborhood. Hopefully. At the Morton Arboretum, every fall they have the Huskies come there. So there's a lot of people that have Huskies that walk around us.
Oh.
And besides the neighbors that were next to us that were from India, really, we had neighbors from Czechoslovakia that came from Berwyn. And they became, everybody was different around us, and they were all pretty close. I don't see that much left because the new papers come in a lot younger, and basically we had more camaraderie in the little valley we lived in because the teachers all had everything for potlucks. We used to have a lot of, some people lived at Pebble Beach. We would go in there and have parties. And I remember the principal had this wonderful live oak tree, and we used to have our picnic under this live oak tree. Well, one of the things, the Morton Arboretum, we cross-country ski. And in the winter, if we wanted to take the kids to a bunny hill, Four Lakes was nearby. But we all had cross-country skis, and we would go to the Arboretum until, the irony is, I-88, which is Eisenhower, in the winter they throw salt on it. and it was killing the trails in Morton Arboretum, which, if you remember, Morton Salt funded the whole Arboretum, and here the irony is salt was killing part of the Arboretum. And so we started going to Wisconsin, to Kettle Moraine, to ski up there. There were things that you could do here, like we go to Mount Trashmore. When Kahootek came, the first comet that caused exciting, there were 25 telescopes that we would view a piece of lid on a lens. It was pretty small. The last Halley's Comet was a lot more exciting. You could see it better. And going back to Mark Twain, you know, he was born when Halley's Comet came and he died when it passed 75 years later. Anyway, there were so many things to do, and we did have a few parties, but people moved a lot. The people sometimes were not there more than a year. The people that we moved into the house, it was funny, when we bought the house, I had never seen the husband, just the wife, but at the closing, I saw this guy. His name was Russ Horton, and he was a friend of mine that was on the football team at Wilson Junior College, and I one time had him write a sports column for me, and I hugged him. I said, my God, you're moving from this wonderful house. He said, yeah, my wife's relatives are in Chicago Heights. I never heard of him again, but it was wonderful. It was a funny thing. We were at the grocery store in California at a Safeway, and there was this girl I recognized, and I couldn't figure out where I knew her from. I'm sorry to go back to California, but it was just interesting. And I said, well, were you in my Shakespeare class? No. Were you in my Poetry of Milton class? No. I can't figure out where you come from. And then I kind of passed by it and I left. I said, oh, you know what happened? I had a job washing dishes at a fraternity in Illinois. I set pins, I did everything, I worked on it. But anyway, there wasn't much food. So I took a job at sorority. They were all on diets. But this one gal, she was always the last one to bring her dishes, and I had to get to class, and I couldn't stand her. That was the gal I saw and said, she wasn't in any of my classes.
Small world.
So anyway, I had some notes here that maybe keep thinking of questions, but
Well, what do you have on your notes?
What's that?
What's on your notes?
Oh.
What you wanted to share?
Well, let's see what I didn't touch. I stressed the museums. Mm-hmm. Have you been to many of the museums? You know, you've got to get to the Shedd Aquarium to see the Filipino coast, you know. All right, you know the common ones downtown, but there's a great museum of Indians in Aurora.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, I didn't talk about national parks, but have you ever been to our national parks?
I haven't.
Well, we used to go 4 main states. Utah was the best, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico. We traveled up and down the Rio Grande, went to buy pottery and jewelry from the natives in their homes, in their pueblos. We were at one where we were trying to buy, there's a piece of pottery with a grandmother with her grandchildren on it, notoriously coming from Cochiti Pueblo. And I have gotten some Cahokia Mountains, right in Illinois. There's a very famous site down in Belleville, Illinois. It's way down south, not far across from St. Louis. And these early mound builders in Illinois are down there, and there's a visitor center that's fantastic. Well, anyway, I bought this piece of pottery there, but I wanted to go to the village, Cochiti, where the potter came from. I did a whole series, totally on Indian chiefs, but I also did Southwest Indian families and different things. We're nuts, and we go to powwows all over the place. Starved Rock is a place to go to wonderful powwows. But anyway, in this particular Cochiti, there was a man who was doing grandfather pottery with grandchildren around it. And he had postcards from around the world and so forth. And I said, your name is Anderson. That's my wife's maiden name. How did you get the name Anderson? He says, well, during World War II, they could never pronounce my name, so they gave me the name Anderson. Oh, and you know that during World War II, Robert Redford made a film on it, and there's books on it. they used the Navajo's language for a code
Oh, yes.
during World War II.
Yes.
The Japanese and Germans could never crack it, So anyway, those experiences with Native Americans, we've been to way up in Upper Peninsula, Michigan, to Powell's and so forth, but the most were on the Rio Grande. And the national parks, our favorite is Arches. But we've been to all of them. Oh, and one other thing, in this area at College DuPage, there's a great club that we belonged to for years, ESCOMI, Earth Science Club of Northern Illinois. We became fossil collectors. We have one of the greatest fossil areas in the country, from Bolingbrook on south down to Coal City, Wilmington, Morris, all these places. The old strip mines for the early days of collecting coal, they kind of destroyed the environment, but they left a lot of these concretions with their fern fossils. They call them tully monsters. You can even find spiders and amber. Jurassic Park brought up the amber, but our area is rich in these, but now it's been pretty overcollected. They had different things like lapidary, gems and minerals and all that stuff, but we were mainly interested in fossil. I actually went out and I made a whole film strip on fossils and showed it to 300 people in our organization for Asconi. They had older people that had geodes and fantastic gems. And part of it, living in Woodridge, gave us the opportunity to be a member of that. And those things, with my wife being a weaver, these were all networks for making a community broaden itself. And there's a little museum in Carroll Stream. Most people don't know. It's a zoo, rather, called Crosley Zoo. I used to like to go to Lamont, the Iowa, Illinois, Michigan Canal. You go to Lockport. You've been there? You see the old area where the mules and the barges went through. Over 80 Irishmen died. We talk about the Panama Canal right here in Illinois, digging that canal. A lot of people lost their lives. Lockport, a lot of the Swedish immigrants were there. It was one of the early places for textiles and weaving right in our area. The Swedish women were doing it. It's a fascinating area to live in. The transportation was so great. The Burlington Railroad. We used to have a comic strip, Dagwood, Bumstead, called Blondie. It was in the papers. I don't know if it's still there.
Still there.
And Dagwood Bumstead would go to the train and catch the last car with his lunch bag. And I did that for many years, catching the Burlington. And sometimes I would miss it and try to catch it down his road. Then I would go to his next
Might as well
stop,
drive in.
my wife. And then coming home, I would stop in the ditches on the way and collect daylilies. Our backyard is full of daylilies and full of lilac trees, which we haul like little plants all the way from Muskegon, Michigan, from my wife's mother's backyard in Muskegon, Michigan. And the lilac trees now, they bloom in the spring. You don't have to go to Lombard, you go to our backyard. But when you think of, the Arboretum right now has a Lego exhibit.
Yeah.
Did you see it?
Yes.
Well, every year they have something new. Next year is ribbons. When they had saplings working on this wonderful man that came. He's done it all around the world, making saplings into shapes. And we've been members for over 40 years. So every year they have this party for members. Last year it had always been 10. Now they upped it to 20. They don't even have records past 20. But we would make 40, and I don't know if there'll be any left. But the people who were sitting next talked about the coyotes on their property because they were. We've seen coyotes right coming down Westmoreland Street, right near Hobson. When I used to drive to Fox Valley, when it first opened, I would be running. My wife would say, "Oh, there goes a fox." So you can see why it was named Fox. And I was trying to think of something else about that. It's just. She could also see woodchucks and stuff like that. But anyway, we have nice bike trails and hiking trails around here. My son used to pick wild strawberries and bring them home. We raised raspberries right on the side of our house. But the best garden is the Japanese garden down the street. They are just marvelous. But let's see what else I got. Keep thinking because
I think you've covered quite a bit, George.
Am I running out of time? Right? If you put up with me, I'll just see what I've missed.
I don't think you've missed a whole lot. In your own way.
Oh,
you've
Christmas.
Covered just about
Christmas
everything.
downtown windows.
Okay.
I mean, oh, you asked about snowstorms too. Christmas downtown. The windows were so fascinating. We used to have lunch at Marshall Field's, one of the greatest stores in the world, and supper rather. And I took my father there. He came from Omaha, and we had a farm there. I became a farmer for a while. When I graduated from college, I told my dad, take a 2-week vacation. I knew how to farm. I lived in Wisconsin. I lived in Texas. And I took care of everything from haying and milking the cows and everything. But these doggone cows were so smart. They knew I was from the city, so they kind of held back their milk from me. My dad said, use a milking machine. But these cows were not raised in a milking machine, so I had to prime them, and then I had to strip them. Even use a milk machine, so I was the heck with that. I just would milk all 10 cows morning and night. And they tried to kick the bucket, so I put kicking hobblers on there. Oh boy, nothing happened now. So then they would swat me with their tails. And so I wasn't smart enough to do what my granddaughter was just in Costa Rica. She sent me a picture. She was at a dairy farm volunteering. And they put the tail and they tied it up with the kicking hobblers, and I could have done that. I learned it from my granddaughter. She's a senior at San Diego State. She just came back from Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, and Belize. Last year she was in Machu Picchu, where she's been. She was in Bolivia at Lake Titicaca. She was in Chile. She was in Buenos Aires, and Argentina. She was in Argentina, and she went to Rio de Janeiro this year. So anyway, she's studying invertebrates, marine biology. She studied sea turtles in Guatemala this year and snails in Costa Rica. She got a scuba license in Panama and then went to Belize for scuba diving. I failed in scuba diving on a windjammer cruise in the Caribbean. It was a marvelous trip.
They do other things on those trips besides scuba.
I'm sorry?
Those are party ships, I've heard.
Oh,
No?
it was more an adventure. They partied the last day, but I swam and I didn't do the dancing. We had a few rum swizzles though, but it was going to different islands every day. And the ship we called it St. Martin, because it being wooden, it could not come to a United States port because of fire regulations. But we flew into Puerto Rico, then we flew to Virgin Islands, and then over to St. Martin. And a lot of our luggage was stolen because anything they could sell, they took out. We didn't think we'd get our luggage back. We bought new clothes and everything at St. Martin. But just before we took the dinghy to the ship, Caribbean Airlines came up with our suitcases. We didn't look at them. We got on the ship and we saw even underwear that was in a package. They took anything they could sell, my wife's jewelry, stuff like that. But we were glad to get most of our clothes back. But it was a wonderful adventure with the British captain, and we could put up the sails. It was originally a fishing boat from the Portuguese that went to...
What was the name of your ship?
It was a Fantan, I think. But one of those ships drowned off in Belize, but they left the crew, the crew stayed, but the passengers left at a port. We went to one island, Antigua, and they were celebrating independence. It was a beautiful little boats with colorful sails, and we didn't know why they were celebrating. And we found out they were celebrating independence. We asked them, well, when did you get your independence? Well, we never got it. We're celebrating because we're going to have it. It reminds me, Time Magazine had an article about these entrepreneurs in Africa going around selling independence. They just took a paper bag and they sold it with nothing in it. They were telling people it was independence. They didn't know better. They paid for it. So anyway.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you for all the stories,
I'm not
George.
done. Don't stop me. I don't want to quit because I didn't give you a chance. Is there anything else? I'm trying to think. You have an interesting life, and your adventures in high school are a great time in your life. I had such fun. I remember I got this job when I was a sports editor before I became editor. I got this call from the Daily Calumet in South Chicago, and they said, we need somebody to cover the sports events at Chicago Vocational. And they said, we'll pay you. And I said, how much will you pay me? They said, $1 a column. I was very prolific. Some weeks I had 8 stores. I set pins in a bowling alley when I was 12. My dad took me down to the Southtown bowling alley, and I got a job. And about 3 weeks after I set pins, an inspector came around, and they fired the manager $500 because I was underage. And I thought I lost my job. And the manager said, no, you're a good pin setter. He won't come around for another year. So then I got a little older, and I was living with different families, so it was good to get out of the house. I could take the Illinois Central train, and I could go to High Park. And they had a bowling alley there with 50 alleys. They needed pin setters, and so I was setting pins there. And they had a split between the 2 alleys. So you just had 2 alleys, and you set leagues, 60. It was usually 30 lines, and on a Sunday I could set 60 lines, 2 leagues. Anyway, I got hit by a pin that sailed through one cutout, knocked me in the temple. I was laying in the alley, and the guy picked up his another ball because he didn't get his ball back, and he bowled right on top of me. They took me to Hyde Park Hospital. I was in there getting an examination, and within 2 hours I was back setting pins. On a Sunday after that, I set 110 lines at 10 cents a line. And it was 8 cents a line. I made $8.80 and $1.50 in tips. I came home at midnight, and I started at 8 in the morning. And my dad said, you made more today than I made at the steel mills. I said, Dad, but I work from 8 in the morning to 12. But my best job in high school as a sophomore, coming up from Texas, they put me in a journalism class because the English classes were for Chicago Vocational. You probably never heard of it. But it was my 2nd year of high school, and a kid in my class said, would you like a job? And I said, where? And he said, downtown. And I said, oh, where? He said, at the Chicago Sun. I said, wonderful. Marshall Field owned a paper called the Chicago Sun. I worked for 3 months, and we got our pink slips because he bought the Times. He made it Sun Times. And I was heartbroken because the Sun was a beautiful, wonderful paper. I had done a paper, even in high school, on PM, a newspaper in New York that was very liberal, and I'm liberal, and it died because of things like McCarthyism that was coming in. Anyway, so here I am, only 3 months, and when school started, I would only work Fridays and Saturdays. So I took this job, and as I was going, all I did for 3 weeks was carry coffee or cups in it and do books and so forth of writers. And I went over and I went to the Herald American, a Hearst newspaper, and I immediately got the job. I was there through the last, 3 years of high school, 2.5 years of high school, and 2 years of junior college. When I got to junior college, I hired 6 friends on the newspaper, and we used to do the Wilson College Press after work at midnight, do headlines, do editing and so forth of copy that I would write. All of my engravings for high school, all the photos were done free by the wonderful engravers of the Herald American. They did them for nothing. They put them on wood blocks, and so I'd bring my photos or artwork, and I would come home. Even during the strike, when the printers were on strike, those engravers did that.
Wonderful.
And I fell in love with the newspaper, but they warned me. Some went to Northwestern. I took a journalism class 1, but I took liberal arts, I took history, I took science, my favorite was literature. I was a major in philosophy. And that enriched my background. It's a good thing because life is not a tunnel. You cannot think that just because you major in something that you're not qualifying yourself for a lot more. So you have to have a wider spectrum. So everything that you touch is a contribution to your future. And anyway, one quick other story. When I was working in Coronet, I was hired, I should mention, I became the first original writer for Playboy magazine. I was called by Hugh Hefner. I didn't know who this guy was. He called me at the University of Illinois, at the Daily Illini office. He said, I'm an alum from Daily Illini, from Illinois, and I'm starting a magazine, and I want a sports editor. And I said, what kind of magazine? And he said, well, something like the New Yorker. And then when he started describing it to me, I said, what are you talking about? Doesn't sound like nothing like that. What do you want a sports writer for? He wants something for the all-purpose man. So he said, come and see me on the south side. It was my old neighborhood at 63rd Street near Stony Island. He had an apartment there. So I go up to see him, and Christy was in the crib. Christy Hefner, his daughter, who became, his wife was there. He takes me into the room, and he shows me a spread of Marilyn Monroe. I said, what is this magazine going to be called? He said, Stag Party. I said, God, I don't know if I want to write for this. And he said, well, let me tell you more. I got some good stories in here. It was all public, in public domain. P.G. Wodehouse, Ambrose Bierce, Civil War story, out of copyright, stuff like that, and some girly stuff. But anyway, I was still at the University of Illinois, and I had this idea for a story on Red Grange, because I call it the all-purpose back. And return to the all-purpose back. And he did everything. He could drop kick, he played offense, he played defense. He was the most outstanding player in the history of Illinois in football, and he went on to Chicago Bears. So they had a little exhibit from at the county courthouse in for DuPage County in Wheaton. If you ever go there, you'll see it. It's funny, during the summer he used to work carrying ice on his shoulder. And growing up in the city, there was no refrigerators. There was ice boxes. You had to buy ice in blocks of 25, and men would carry it up on leather shoulder things, and they would carry this ice on picks, and they would bring it off of trucks. We would jump on the back of the truck after they left, because they would lay ice chips in the summer. So, by the way, when we first moved to Woodridge, we had no air conditioning, so we used to go to Yorktown Mall so it'd get cool. There was no flat to Opdorp, but anyway. That copy boy job was so great, to meet wonderful people, except it was really strange because we had a teletype machine from San Simeon. And you know where that is?
No.
Hearst Castle, on the coast of California, near San Luis Obispo, up the coast. And Hearst had this teletype machine, and he did what Colonel McCormick did. He put editorials on the first page like it was a news column. He was a big guy on anti-vivisection. You weren't supposed to cut up animals for research. And there was a rewrite man named Larry Kelly, and he would send me as a copy boy, by then I was a freshman in college, to get a pint of whiskey, Corby's, the cheapest whiskey, so that he could swig down a pint of whiskey before he had to rewrite the script from San Simeon. One of them was The Decadence of Clark Street. I said, what are you going to write about? He says, I'll find something. My brain works better when I'm drunk. It reminds me of Citizen Kane. In Citizen Kane, the writer in that wrote a sequence about, it was a parallel of Marion Davies and a parallel of Hearst buying an opera house for her to sing. She wanted to sing and be in movies, and he started a movie company, Hearst did, for her. So that's a parallel what happened in real life for Mankiewicz. Joseph Mankiewicz was the writer. He was a writer for the Herald American, the paper I worked for, and out of the window we could see the Civic Opera House. The history of Chicago, the guy that had the money to build all the streetcars in Chicago had a wife who wanted to be a singer, and she was terrible. So he built the Civic Opera House for her. She was so terrible that Mankiewicz, who at that time was working at Herald American, was a reviewer. He was doing the review, and he fell drunk on the typewriter because it was so horrible, a premiere of this woman. And he adapted that same thing for Citizen Kane. And this is a true story. We misspelled Montreal on the headline on the Sunday edition. Harry Romanoff, the night city editor, says, George, Jennings, go get Jerry Hagan, the Sunday editor. We cannot run a replate with the correct thing until I get a signature. They were down there waiting with the presses with the replate. I went to 6 bars before I could find the guy. I finally found him. I had to hold his hand to sign the signature, rush back, and then the replates run. If you ever read a book by Katharine Graham, and it's all about the Washington Post, there was a strike. She lost her husband. He kind of committed suicide. He was just all screwed up. And she had to run the paper herself. And she grew up in a family. She didn't even know how to dress herself. She had people dressing herself. His father was so rich. But she was a wonderful, wonderful woman. Katharine Graham. It's a personal history that she wrote. Warren Buffett, who invested in the Washington Post and Newsweek, came from Omaha to help her get the paper out. He worked with the pressmen. So anyway, I can ramble on, but it's just enriching.
I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
But I want to tell you how much I appreciated
I
all that you've
apologize for
told us.
ranting,
Oh,
but
please don't do that. What a pleasure it's been.
Yes.
Did we?
We really appreciate your stories,
Yeah, but
and they're really great stories.
deviated
I think
from-
maybe we need a
I did.
part 2
A part two.
sometime.
She's
Or
heard a lot of
maybe-
this anyway.
And she'll, and she's
Or maybe
still like
we
to hear
could-
it again.
Well,
like
a lot of this stuff.
5 chapters.
But